Hey there, guys. So today I want to go over a topic that I feel could resonate with a lot of you, especially when it comes to, of course, the coming out process. And of course, if you're somebody who has grown up in church or has been, in a church environment. Now, where I live, of course, here in Tennessee, I do live in southern Tennessee, so I'm, right in the Bible Belt itself. So this is a really, of course, tough area to really be open in. But it's really important to not lose sight of yourself, even though you may live in an area that is not as accepting, in other words. And I think, you know, maybe a lot of people may be wondering, how do you actually, confront, your sexuality while living in the area. And one thing I think it, especially with me, the way that I, was really able to come to the aspect of accepting myself is really just to be honest. Um, One thing that I always thought whenever I was going through my coming out process is I thought it was best to be honest with people. But sometimes, people don't take it the right way, so it is hard. I think it's the hardest thing. And especially too, because, again, I was really, grew up, I wouldn't say that I grew up in a very Christian family, but of course we were more, Christian, sort of, we had sort of a Christian upbringing in a lot of ways. I didn't really grow up necessarily in church. Church became a big thing whenever I was a teenager, and whenever, I came out at that time. That was sort of the thing that I felt like after that time, that I felt like I was doing something wrong and I needed to go to church because of that fact of, realizing that I was gay. And that was the reason why I went to church. And so, I was sort of, I guess, thrown into that specific type of environment. And I just remembered, that was really one of the only reasons why I was going to church, was because of that. And, like I've mentioned before, I went through a lot of different times in church where it was like, there were things that were said to me that I didn't, that really hurt me in a lot of ways and really, have stuck with me. And like I say over and over again, words do matter, and words really do, hold, on to you for years and years and years. That's like with the time when I was bullied in school. But going back to the aspect of church, I've always, had this sort of, you know, challenging, relationship with church, because I think that there is such a difference between the aspect of how you're supposed to act versus what is, really told in the Bible. And there's these two separate worlds that don't necessarily align. One thing I do want to share recently, and I don't want to go deep into it because it's a whole separate thing, but I have been going through a lot of, sort of understanding and questions of faith. I've been going through it for at least over the past year or so, and sort of, I guess you would say, deconstructing in a lot of ways. And again, when you're somebody that's gay and you've grown up into an environment that has, kind of pushed you down in a lot of ways and told you that everything you're doing is wrong, that you've got to do this, you've got to do that, it becomes really hard, to stay within something like that, stay within that environment and that type of, I guess just a dogma. In other words, it's hard to stay in that environment. And why would you want to stay in that environment if it's not going to accept you in any way, and if it's not going to support you, and if it's just going to go against you anyways? So what I want to say is that if you're somebody who is kind of struggling with faith and, your sexuality and identity, I completely understand that. And I think that no matter where you're at in your journey, if you still want to, be aligned with your faith, that's totally fine. But I don't think it's wrong for people to take a step back and question their belief system and understanding why they believe the things they do. And I think it's important to really understand what you believe. And I think that's the biggest problem why there is a lot of, sort of this complete, just this, I guess this bigotry towards people is that there's not a full understanding. There's people all the time that will act a certain way and act as if they are, a Christian, but they won't actually read the Bible. One of the things that I did, like I've mentioned, I came back home because, I was living in California for 3 years. I came back home and I tried to change, in other words, quote unquote. And when I came back home to try to change, what I had committed to was reading my Bible for, pretty much daily. And I was reading my Bible pretty much every single day. I had a, Bible plan that I was going through that was, like reading the Bible throughout a year. And I was reading it daily. And I was reading it for a few years. And like I mentioned, at this time, I was staying celibate. I wasn't, doing anything. I knew that I still had feelings for guys. It was still there, but I was trying to quote unquote change. And as I was going through this journey, I was reading every single day. And you can ask, my parents, they know how much I was reading. I was always reading every day. I was reading the Bible every day. I was trying to study. And the more that I read, the more that I was getting questions. The more that I had conflicting views, like conflicting moral views on what was in the Bible versus, my own beliefs, like, or my own, sort of ideas of what is morally right. In other words, like the issues with slavery in the Bible. Like, there's a lot of things that I could kind of go into that I had a lot of questions with, and I still have a lot of questions with. But it's even harder when you're somebody, you know, especially when you get the passages thrown around you around sexuality and around being gay. And that's the only sort of reference that's out there. That's maybe like 3 verses. And nobody looks at the entire context of everything else. And they don't look at the whole picture. And that's a big problem that I think is such a, you know, it's sad and it's unnecessary that people act the way that they act. You have so many people that have committed suicide. Even there's people in my town and area that have committed suicide because of them not being accepted of who they are. And so I hope that one day in the future, or whenever that may happen, that people will understand that I'll take a step back and take the time to step in somebody's shoes and understand, you know, why is my son, my daughter feeling the way that they're feeling? Shouldn't I at least take a step back and sort of understanding what they're feeling, And it's just something that's bothered me. The aspect of the church and how people are treated because of people not entirely reading their Bible and completely shattering, the hearts of people who really care and are trying to be honest and coming out to their families. And so that's just something that I wanted to share and really wanted to touch on. Talking about church, I've been trying to tiptoe around it because I know it's been a big part of my journey to, and I'm always afraid to say and be honest about how I feel and how, about my faith, because I've been having a lot of questions about, Christianity in itself. And I'm not saying that if somebody, your beliefs are invalid, but for me in my own personal journey, I have a lot of questions But I just wanted to share this. I wanted to give somebody or anybody who's kind of having the feeling of struggling with their faith and their sexuality at the same time, and just know that you're not alone in that journey, that I know how that journey feels, and it's not an easy journey to go through. But thank you guys once again for taking the time to check this out. I really am looking forward to sharing more topics with you, really diving into deeper topics, when it comes to sexuality, identity, and LGBTQ issues in particular.